Imagine, just for a second, that you wield the ultimate legal authority. You are the sovereign. And in this capacity, according to the really fascinating framework we're digging into in today's explainer, you get to do exactly what kings do. You create your own court, and you decree your own laws. The stakes here, well, they're incredibly high, almost cinematic, really. Because if a sovereign has the unbridled absolute power to just declare any rule and demand total obedience, what exactly is preventing that power from mutating into absolute unyielding oppression?
Right? It's the ultimate existential threat. If the very essence of sovereignty is that the sovereign simply creates the law out of thin air, what's stopping that sovereign from creating a world of pure, unadulterated chaos? We usually think of common law as this rigid system of historical precedents, but the sources we are unpacking today present it as something way more primal and, honestly, a lot more dramatic. If you can literally make up any rule you want, where's the barrier between sovereignty and a completely lawless dictatorship?
Okay, let's dive into this with a brilliantly absurd hypothetical straight from the source material. They call it the pink shoe law. Imagine I'm the sovereign, right? And I decide I am deeply personally offended by pink shoes. In fact, they burn my retinas. So I just pass a law. Anyone wearing pink shoes in my presence gets the death penalty. I know, it sounds totally ridiculous. But here's the catch. If I am the sovereign and my decree literally makes the law, well, this is now technically the law of my court. I've just created a capital offense out of a fashion choice.
So here is the multi-million-dollar question for us. What actually stops me from enforcing this? How does society prevent my completely bizarre pink shoe law from becoming a deadly, terrifying reality for everyone else? If I can decree literally anything, how do we avoid waking up in a completely arbitrary dictatorship where the rules change based on, what I had for breakfast?
Well, it all comes down to the dual check system, the perfectly balanced architecture of accountability.
The answer this framework provides is a beautifully designed system of accountability. See, far from being a lawless free-for-all, this system is actually described as the most accountable form of law ever devised, and it operates in two completely opposite directions. First, there's the government-to-sovereign check, which prevents the government from oppressing the sovereign. In that case, jurisdiction has to be strictly proven, and the magistrate acts as nothing more than a mirror, not a ruler. But what we're really focusing on today is the other side, the sovereign-to-community check. This is the exact mechanism that prevents our power-hungry sovereign's pink shoe law from tyrannizing the entire community. The ultimate filter here is reasonableness, and it's enforced by the community itself, which is exactly why understanding this is absolutely crucial for how we view our own legal structures today.
Which brings us to check one, the jury, also known as the Great Leveler.
Think of the jury as our absolute first line of defense against our hypothetical dictator. It acts like a massive shield, specifically designed to protect the defendant from the arbitrary whims of the plaintiff, or in this case, the sovereign. Now, we're usually taught that a jury has one job, right? To judge the facts of the case. Like, did the defendant actually wear the pink shoes? But in this common law framework, the jury has a vital second job that honestly gets completely overlooked. They actually have to judge the law itself. They use their innate human sense of right and wrong to decide if the sovereign's decreed law is actually reasonable in the first place. If 100% of society, represented by those 12 everyday people in the box, thinks the law is absurd, boom, the sovereign's power hits a brick wall.
And this brilliantly illustrates the real power of that first check. Think about it. If I try to enforce my wild pink shoe law, what are the actual chances a jury of 12 regular everyday people will support a death penalty for footwear? Exactly zero. No way. Through a process called jury nullification, they completely kill the absurd decree. On the flip side, what if I decree that unprovoked assault, like just walking up and punching a random person in the eye, warrants 30 days in jail? A jury will absolutely convict based on pure common sense. The system perfectly protects a defendant from crazy laws, but enforces the reasonable ones flawlessly.
Now for check two, the show, the court as a literal stage.
But wait, what happens after the jury? Or what if there isn't a jury at all? Well, this brings us to the ultimate physical check in the entire system. This framework posits that a court isn't just some dusty, boring bureaucracy filled with endless paperwork. No, it is a literal stage. The show is defined as a very public display of evidence, undeniable logic, and argument. And the sovereign has to conduct this show visibly so that the rest of the world can see with their very own eyes that the judgment is just and fair. Basically, if the sovereign can't satisfy the outside world that their decision is rock solid, the whole thing falls apart. It's a performance of logic. And the audience? The audience is the community.
So who actually represents that audience? Enter the sheriff. The sheriff is the physical embodiment of the community's reason. And remember, the sheriff is elected, not appointed by a bureaucrat. So when the sheriff receives a court order, he doesn't look at it like a fancy lawyer or a judge. He looks at it as a reasonable man representing his neighbors. He's the de facto posse of the people. He's the guy who ultimately decides if the show is actually convincing or not.
Let's look at how this actually plays out in reality. If the sovereign puts on what we'll call a good show, let's say they're demanding $4,000 for documented, real damages, backed up with totally clear legal reasoning. The sheriff looks at it and says, yeah, okay, this makes sense. He is satisfied, so he picks up his gun and he enforces the judgment. But if it's a bad show, say a $1 billion demand based on flimsy grounds, or, I don't know, a capital offense for wearing pink shoes, the sheriff is absolutely not satisfied. The show failed. The sheriff simply refuses to act. And just like that, the judgment dies right there on the spot.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the historical context. This dynamic is famously known as the arsenic factor. See, back in ancient times, a tyrannical king always had to worry that if his private judgments were just too brutal or unjust, his own cook might just slip a little arsenic into his evening meal. Well, the modern equivalent of that cook is the sheriff. Today's modern sovereign lives in fear of the sheriff's refusal to enforce an unreasonable demand. So the mechanism evolved, right? We went from literal arsenic to a simple refusal of enforcement. But the core principle is identical. A sovereign absolutely cannot survive if the community isn't satisfied.
So the ultimate takeaway from all this is right here. The sheriff's gun is the proof that common law is not lawlessness, because the final physical enforcement of the law doesn't rest with some distant legislature or a faceless appointed bureaucrat. It rests with a locally elected man who literally has to look his neighbors in the eye. That makes the system intensely, incredibly accountable. It prevents tyranny by ensuring that no rule, no matter how forcefully decreed by a sovereign, can ever overcome the collective, basic common sense of the community.
It really is a profound reframing of law, of power, and of the actual mechanisms that keep us free from arbitrary rule. It reminds us that true accountability doesn't just trickle from the top down. It grows from the ground up, enforced by the everyday reason of the people. So, in our modern world of endless, overwhelming legislation, you have to ask yourself, who is actually guarding your common sense? Class is now in session.